The darkness before sunrise on that 17th day of December in 1944 carried a penetrating cold that seemed to settle into everything it touched. Around the small Belgian village of Honsveld, the hedgerows wore thick coats of frost that caught what little light existed in those pre-dawn hours, transforming the landscape into something ghostly and unreal. In the midst of this frozen tableau, a massive German Tiger tank sat motionless, its enormous bulk reduced to an expensive piece of sculpture by the simplest of problems. The Maybach engine, that powerful piece of German engineering that normally roared with such authority, coughed once, then twice, producing sounds that grew progressively weaker before finally surrendering to silence altogether. The man standing in the turret, SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper, responded to this mechanical failure with a violence that suggested he understood exactly what it meant. His palm came down hard against the turret ring, producing a sharp metallic sound that cut through the quiet morning air like a gunshot. At 29 years old, Peiper had already built a reputation as one of the most capable and most ruthless commanders in the Waffen-SS, a man who had learned the hard lessons of mechanized warfare on the vast expanses of the Eastern Front. One of those lessons, perhaps the most important one, was now being driven home with brutal clarity. Down in the driver's compartment, the tanker tried the starter mechanism again, hoping perhaps that the engine would somehow respond differently this time. It did not. The gauge that measured fuel sat with its needle firmly planted on empty, and when someone checked the reserve tank, they found it just as dry. Behind Peiper's immobilized Tiger, stretching back along the narrow Belgian roads, sat the armoured spearhead that German High Command had selected to accomplish what they believed might be the decisive stroke of the war in the West. Dozens of tanks, including more Tigers and the slightly lighter but still formidable Panthers, sat waiting. Hundreds of half-tracks carrying Waffen-SS troops idled in formation. Thousands of soldiers, equipped and trained and ready for combat, found themselves suddenly transformed into spectators by something as prosaic as the absence of gasoline. All that steel, all that firepower, all that carefully accumulated expertise and fighting spirit rendered completely useless by empty fuel tanks. They might as well have been statues planted in the cold Belgian earth for all the good they could do in their current condition. Then something changed. The fog that had been hanging over the area began to lift as the sun started its slow climb toward the horizon, and as visibility improved, Peiper's men began to see what the Americans had left behind when they evacuated their forward positions. The evidence suggested that the withdrawal had been hasty, perhaps even panicked. Coffee sat in metal cups, still giving off steam in the cold morning air. Fires continued to burn in the oil drums that the Americans had used to keep warm during their watch, and stacked everywhere, arranged in neat rows that stretched across the ground in quantities that seemed almost impossible to believe, were 5-gallon containers. They were painted in that distinctive olive-drab color that marked American military equipment, each one carefully stenciled with identifying information. The irony would not have been lost on anyone who understood the history of these particular containers. The Allies called them jerry cans, a name that acknowledged they were based on a German design that the Americans had essentially copied because it was superior to their own fuel containers. One of Peiper's men approached the nearest stack and pried open a can. The smell that emerged was immediate and unmistakable. High-octane fuel, the sharp and slightly sweet odour cutting through the cold morning air and announcing its presence to everyone nearby. They began the process of feeding this captured American gasoline into German engines, while Peiper himself walked among the rows of containers, his mind working through calculations. He counted stacks and estimated volumes and arrived at figures that seemed almost too good to be true. Tens of thousands of gallons sitting there for the taking. Perhaps even more than that. Enough, his initial assessment suggested, to revive his entire column and push forward toward the ultimate objective that High Command had designated for this offensive. The Meuse River lay ahead, and crossing it would open the route to Antwerp, the massive Belgian port through which Allied supplies flowed like a river. The arithmetic of the situation initially felt like salvation to Peiper. The fuel allocation that German planners had provided for his formation had been barely adequate under the best circumstances. They had received enough gasoline to fight their way through perhaps 50 miles of contested territory, and that was assuming everything went according to plan, which it never did in actual combat. Yet Antwerp sat more than 60 miles beyond even the Meuse crossing, through terrain that included hills and forests and river valleys, all of which would be defended by American forces who were certain to resist with everything they had. The briefing that Peiper had received before the offensive began had addressed this apparent discrepancy between fuel supply and operational objectives with a simple directive. "Capture enemy stocks," the planners had said, "and you will make it." The entire operation depended on seizing American fuel dumps and using the enemy's own gasoline to continue the advance. But as the metallic clattering of fuel cans continued and the gurgling sound of gasoline being funneled into tanks filled the air, another thought began to work its way into Peiper's consciousness. This was not some massive supply depot that the Americans had been forced to abandon after fierce fighting. This was just a forward refueling point, a relatively minor facility that served the tactical needs of frontline units, and yet the quantities involved were staggering by German standards. What kind of military force, Peiper found himself wondering, could afford to leave so much behind when they withdrew? What did it say about an opponent's overall resources and logistical capabilities when they could simply walk away from tens of thousands of gallons of precious fuel without apparently giving it a second thought? If the Americans had so much gasoline that they could casually abandon supplies that would keep a German armoured column moving for days, what did that imply about the fundamental balance of resources in this war? The answer to that question had actually been documented with precision roughly 6 months earlier, though Peiper would not have known the specific details. Albert Speer, the man responsible for German armaments production and economic planning, had carried a report to Hitler that laid out the fuel situation in terms that should have been impossible to misunderstand. Allied bombing raids had systematically targeted and destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel production capacity, those industrial plants that converted coal into liquid fuel through chemical processes. The names of these facilities read like a roll call of German industrial capacity: Luna, Perlitz, Blechhammer and others. Places that had once produced millions of tons of synthetic fuel annually. The bombing campaign had been devastatingly effective. Output had crashed by approximately 90% from peak production levels. At the same time, across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States had produced something in the range of 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil during that year of 1944. Germany's total petroleum production, including both the remaining synthetic output and what they could still extract from Romanian oil fields, totaled somewhere near 33 million barrels. The comparison was so lopsided that it barely seemed worth making. A mechanized military empire that depended absolutely on petroleum products but could not produce adequate supplies of petroleum was a fundamental contradiction, an impossibility that was nevertheless the reality Germany faced. The Ardennes offensive, given the codename Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, represented an attempt to use audacity and tactical surprise to overcome this crushing disadvantage in resources. The planning had incorporated several assumptions that were meant to level the playing field. The weather forecast called for heavy cloud cover and fog, conditions that would keep Allied aircraft grounded and eliminate the overwhelming advantage in air power that the Allies normally enjoyed. The element of surprise would paralyze American forces at the front, creating confusion and preventing them from mounting an organized defense in the critical early hours. Special operations units would seize key bridges before they could be demolished, allowing German armor to maintain momentum and avoid the delays that came with finding alternate river crossings. But underneath all of these tactical considerations sat the unforgiving mathematics of fuel consumption. Staff officers working with maps and charts and historical data had estimated that the drive to the Meuse River alone would require approximately 4.5 million gallons of gasoline, When the first German artillery shells began exploding in American positions in the pre-dawn hours of December 16th, German forces had only a small fraction of that required fuel actually in their possession. Peiper understood these calculations better than most officers at his level because his experience on the Eastern Front had taught him lessons that peacetime training could never convey. In the vast expanses of Russia, where distances could swallow entire armies and supply lines stretched until they snapped, fuel had proven itself more valuable than ammunition in many situations. You could fight without bullets if you had to, using captured weapons and scavenged supplies, but you could not move a tank column without gasoline, and a stationary tank was just a pillbox waiting to be destroyed. His orders for the Ardennes offensive had emphasized fuel conservation with an urgency that reflected this reality. Engines were to be shut off during any halt, no matter how brief. Tanks were to move in tight formation, nose to tail, reducing the amount of idling and wasted fuel. American fuel dumps were designated as priority objectives, more important in some ways than seizing key terrain or destroying enemy formations. Yet, from the very beginning of the offensive, Peiper's column had moved more slowly than the operational plans required. The roads that appeared on German maps as substantial highways proved to be something quite different in reality. Many of them were little more than farm lanes, narrow tracks that had never been designed to carry heavy armour. Traffic congestion became immediate and severe. At a tiny crossroads called Lanzerath, a single American reconnaissance platoon consisting of just 18 men had managed to delay Peiper's advance for hours through nothing more than stubborn resistance. Every minute of delay meant fuel burning for no purpose. Tigers consumed gasoline at alarming rates even when they were simply sitting still with their engines running. The need to keep engines idling so they would not freeze in the brutal cold meant that precious fuel drained away constantly, achieving nothing except preventing mechanical failure. Honsfeld had therefore felt like a reprieve, a stroke of good fortune that would allow the offensive to continue. But Peiper's growing understanding of what he was seeing prevented him from feeling any genuine relief. This was not a major depot, not one of the massive storage facilities that supplied entire army groups. It was just a forward refueling point for the American 99th Infantry Division, a place where frontline units could quickly top off their tanks before returning to combat. And still, Peiper's men had found gasoline containers stacked 3 meters high in pyramids that stretched across open ground. The fuel itself came in different grades, a mixture of ordinary motor fuel and aviation-grade gasoline that was sometimes too high in octane for the finicky German engines that had been designed to run on lower-quality fuel. Using aviation gasoline in ground vehicles could cause problems with engine timing and performance, but when the alternative was having no fuel at all, such concerns became luxuries that could not be afforded. In a small office building near the fuel dump, one of Peiper's sergeants discovered paperwork that traced the journey this gasoline had taken before arriving in Honsfeld. The manifests documented a supply chain that operated on a scale that would have seemed fantastical to German logistics officers. Oil extracted from fields in Texas had been refined at facilities on the east coast of the United States, then loaded onto tankers for the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to ports in Britain. From there it had crossed the English Channel to Normandy, where American forces had established a foothold the previous June. Then it had moved by truck convoy through France and into Belgium, covering hundreds of miles through territory that had been enemy-controlled just months earlier. The entire journey, from Texas oil field to Belgian village, had taken a matter of weeks. Nearby, newspapers that the Americans had left behind carried stories about engineering projects that seemed to belong more to peacetime than to an active war zone. A new pipeline running from the port of Cherbourg to the city of Verdun was reportedly capable of pushing hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel per day through its length. For Peiper, reading these documents and seeing these reports provided a glimpse into an enemy supply system that functioned on a completely different scale from anything in German experience. That supply machine had names and specifications that would have amazed anyone who took the time to study them. Operation Pluto, which stood for Pipeline Under the Ocean, had actually laid fuel lines beneath the English Channel, allowing petroleum products to flow directly from Britain to France without requiring the use of vulnerable tanker ships. Inland, American engineers had created an extensive network of pipelines designated as POL lines, with POL standing for petroleum oil lubricants. These pipelines soon delivered close to 1 million gallons of fuel daily in some sectors of the front, quantities that exceeded the total fuel allocation for entire German army groups. The Red Ball Express, a truck convoy operation that was largely staffed by African-American drivers who had been relegated to support roles by the segregated American military, had already hauled more than 400,000 tons of supplies across France in the months following the Normandy invasion. The fuel consumed by the Red Ball Express trucks themselves, just to keep the convoy system running, exceeded the total monthly fuel allocation that German Army Group B received. American divisions had been standardized in their organization and equipment, which meant that parts were interchangeable and vehicles were relatively efficient in their fuel consumption. A Sherman tank, the standard American medium tank, used less than 1 gallon of gasoline per mile, traveled under normal conditions. A Tiger tank, with its much larger engine and heavier weight, could consume more than 2.5 gallons per mile under similar circumstances. By the middle of December, First Army, just one of several American armies operating in the European theatre, routinely recorded daily fuel receipts that exceeded 1 million gallons, and on most days they actually issued less fuel than they received, meaning that reserves were growing even as active combat operations continued. The route that Peiper's spearhead followed took them through a series of small Belgian towns and villages. Büllingen fell to the German advance, then Ligneville, then the town of Malmedy. It was at Malmedy that an event occurred which would stain Peiper's reputation permanently and cast a dark shadow over the entire campaign. 84 American prisoners of war were shot in a snowy field, murdered while they were defenseless and under guard. The massacre would become one of the most notorious war crimes committed on the Western Front, and Peiper's name would be forever associated with it, regardless of whether he personally gave the order or was even present when it happened. In the aftermath, Peiper would claim that he could not spare the fuel necessary to transport prisoners to the rear areas, suggesting that even this atrocity had been touched by the obsession with fuel conservation that dominated German operations. Whether this explanation was true or simply a convenient rationalization for murder remained a question that would never be satisfactorily answered. The spearhead pressed forward from Malmedy toward the town of Stavelot, and beyond it to the Meuse River crossings that represented the operational objective. There, the American response to the German advance made the strategic reality visible in a dramatic and unmistakable form. The fuel depot at Stavelot sprawled across acres of ground, with containers of gasoline stacked like hay bales on a farm, row after row of the precious liquid that Peiper's forces so desperately needed. As German lead elements began closing in on the facility on the afternoon of December 17th, American combat engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion made a decision that demonstrated exactly how the two sides valued fuel differently. They pulled fuses and lit them, threw white phosphorus grenades that ignited on contact, and created trails of flaming gasoline that spread across the depot. A wall of fire roared upward toward the sky, while black smoke twisted into columns that could be seen for miles in every direction. More than 2 million gallons of gasoline burned in that single inferno at Stavelot, deliberately destroyed by American forces to keep it out of German hands. Across the entire sector where the German offensive was unfolding, as German units threatened to overrun other American supply dumps, American commanders issued the same order and American engineers carried it out with the same efficiency. At Spa, at Trois Ponts, at smaller unnamed dumps scattered throughout the region, American forces set fire to their own fuel supplies rather than allow them to be captured. In just the first week of the offensive, American forces deliberately destroyed something in excess of 8 million gallons of gasoline. For the Americans, this represented surplus supplies that could be replaced relatively quickly. For the Germans, those 8 million gallons represented a decisive quantity that would have fundamentally altered the course of the campaign if they had been able to capture and use them. By this point in the offensive, the fundamental mismatch in fuel availability was beginning to multiply other tactical setbacks that German forces were experiencing. American engineers demolished bridges ahead of Peiper's advance at Trois Ponts and elsewhere, forcing the column to seek alternate routes and detours that consumed both time and precious gasoline. The terrain itself imposed higher fuel consumption rates than the planning estimates had assumed. Panthers and tigers laboured to climb grades through the hilly Belgian landscape, struggled to navigate through the constricted streets of villages that had been built centuries before anyone imagined armoured vehicles, and churned through muddy shoulders when roads proved too narrow for formations to pass. The maintenance officer for Peiper's regiment would later compile records showing that they had burned through tens of thousands of gallons of fuel in just 2 days of operations. Captured stocks, despite the initial windfall at Honsfeld, were not keeping pace with consumption rates. Signals intelligence intercepts gave American commanders clear evidence that German tank formations were running critically low on fuel, and orders went out through American chains of command with brutal simplicity. Leave no gasoline behind for the enemy to capture. Destroy every drop before allowing it to fall into German hands. Overhead, the weather remained the wild card that Hitler and German planners had counted on to neutralize Allied air superiority, but the weather only cooperated for a limited time. As the skies began to clear on December 23rd, Allied aircraft appeared in swarms. Thunderbolt fighter bombers and Marauder medium bombers took to the air in numbers that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks if German forces had attempted to match them sortie for sortie. These aircraft consumed fuel at rates that seemed almost incomprehensible by German standards, yet they landed, rearmed, refueled, and flew again, sometimes completing multiple missions in a single day. On that same day, December 23rd, C-47 transport aircraft flew supply missions to the encircled American forces at Bastogne, dropping everything from ammunition to medical supplies by parachute. Among the supplies dropped into Bastogne were containers of gasoline, fuel delivered by air to keep American vehicles and generators running inside the perimeter. Peiper's situation by this point had become desperate in a way that no amount of tactical skill could resolve. His column had perhaps 1,000 gallons of fuel remaining, maybe slightly more, but nowhere near enough to continue offensive operations or even to conduct an organized withdrawal with all of his vehicles. He faced a choice that no commander wants to confront. He could commit his remaining fuel to one final push forward, hoping that some opportunity would present itself, or he could conserve enough gasoline to allow his forces to withdraw before they were completely surrounded and destroyed. He chose survival over glory or redemption. During the last night of December 23rd, extending into the early hours of December 24th, his men systematically destroyed equipment that they could not take with them. 39 armoured vehicles remained mechanically sound and fully capable of combat, but they sat immobilized by empty fuel tanks. These tanks and assault guns were scuttled, rendered useless to the enemy through the expenditure of the last shells and the last gasoline that could be spared. Peiper and what remained of his command slipped away on foot through the snow, abandoning the vehicles and heavy equipment that had made them such a formidable force. Of the roughly 5,000 men who had set out with Peiper when the offensive began, only a fraction made it back to German lines. News of the burned fuel caches, of the millions upon millions of gallons that the Americans had casually denied to the attackers by setting them on fire, spread through German headquarters and command posts. Some officers, those with enough experience and intellectual honesty to accept unpleasant truths, understood immediately what this meant. An opponent who could afford to waste what you lacked, who could destroy in an afternoon more resources than you could accumulate in months, could not be defeated through brilliant tactical maneuvers alone. The fundamental imbalance in resources was simply too great. Hitler, when presented with photographs showing the fuel dumps burning and reports documenting the quantities destroyed, dismissed them as fabrications created by Allied propaganda. He refused to accept that the enemy possessed resources on such a scale. Albert Speer, reading the refinery reports and production statistics that came across his desk, had no such illusions. He understood the numbers and what they meant. The statistics were indeed a verdict, though not one that favoured Germany. The United States was producing the majority share of the world's petroleum output, something in the range of 60% or more of all crude oil extracted globally. American industry was also producing roughly half of the world's manufactured goods during this period, an achievement that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Ships were coming out of American shipyards at a rate measured in days. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines at a pace measured in hours. Tanks were being produced so rapidly that the interval between units could be measured in minutes. Industry had been transformed into momentum, converting raw materials and labour into military power at a scale that overwhelmed traditional calculations of military strength. In Europe during that winter of 1944 and 1945, pipelines and truck columns proved to be just as decisive as armoured battalions and infantry divisions. The ability to sustain operations, to replace losses, to maintain the flow of supplies regardless of weather or tactical setbacks, gave the Allies an advantage that tactical brilliance could not overcome. The bulge that German forces had created in Allied lines would eventually recede as American and British forces counterattacked. The front lines would be restored to roughly where they had been before the offensive began. Bridges that had been destroyed would be rebuilt. Towns that had been damaged in the fighting would start the process of reconstruction. But for Jochen Peiper, the moment of true clarity had come earlier, among those stacked fuel containers at Honsfeld in the cold dawn of December 17th. He had found what appeared at first to be a treasure, enough gasoline to continue his advance and perhaps achieve the breakthrough that German strategy required. But he had also found a mirror, and what that mirror showed him was the reality of the war he was fighting. He saw a modern industrialized conflict being decided not by courage or tactical skill or even strategic vision, but by fuel production capacity and logistical efficiency. He saw an enemy for whom millions of gallons of gasoline were just pieces on a board, supplies that could be moved or destroyed as tactical circumstances required, without any real concern for the loss, because more fuel was already on its way. In that moment at Honsfeld, standing among the evidence of American abundance, Peiper had seen not opportunity, but the end, the inevitable conclusion toward which the mathematics of the war had been pointing all along.